Another episode of Witty CFB. Your host Rob Sheply here. On today's episode, we got Laner from Laner's College Football Pod joining us to talk a little bit about the Georgia Bulldogs and Alabama. Josh, it's great to have you on, and looking forward to talking some football with you. And if you can give the audience just a little Cliff Notes version of what your podcast's all about, it'd definitely be appreciated.
Thanks, Rob. Man, first of all, thanks for having me on, dude. I love this setup. This is incredible. Got the headlines going down there. That's amazing. And thanks for having me on. Yeah. Started Laner's College Football Pod. This is our third season running. It's a lot of fun. We try to do 2 episodes a week, one on Sunday, one on Tuesday, recap episode for the week before, and then a look forward episode with a little more of the breaking news headlines. Man, a lot of the Sundays have had breaking news though lately with all these coaches getting fired. So, but yeah, we like to have fun, and it's just a quality, clean, fun college football pod.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll put thank you for sharing that, and I'll definitely put all your social medias and the link to your show in the description below. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's just been totally polarizing in terms of some of the headlines, particularly in the SEC between Florida and Auburn and all that good stuff too. But we turn our attention to Georgia, number 5 in the country right now, going to be on the road for Starkville this week. And I think one of the fascinating things about Georgia has been this year is, they haven't been as dominant as the past couple of years. And I feel like we set the bar so much higher for them compared to other teams. And rightfully so, right? Because Kirby Smart's, one of the best coaches in college football that we have right now. But, you look at this Georgia team and, they had some shaky performances against Tennessee. They lost 24-21 to Alabama. And now they're riding a 4-game win streak going into Mississippi State. So, Josh, my question to you is, when you look at this Georgia team, what have been some of the things that you've been impressed by them, and what are some of the things that you kind of anticipate on seeing as they presumably head into the college football playoff, assuming that they win out their schedule here, which I anticipate that they do, assuming they beat Texas and Georgia Tech at the end of the year.
Yeah, well, Rob, you're exactly right. They're certainly in a ton of close one-score games. The one thing that sticks out to me is that I don't think people have adjusted to the new era of college football. I think with NIL, with transfer portal, with all that kind of stuff, teams are more even. There's not as big of a gap in these opponents. Like, even for example, when do you think the last time is that they faced off with Mississippi State and the spread was less than a touchdown? I think last time I looked, it's 5.5 right now, favored for Georgia. I mean, that's shocking, right? And you talk about Mississippi State being one of those basement teams in the SEC and Georgia being the perennial power. And people do look at Kirby Smart as probably the best coach, if not certainly a top 3 coach in college football. So you can just expect Georgia to run out there every week and roll over teams. That's not the case anymore in modern college football, and especially in the SEC this year. The thing that impresses me about Georgia, Rob, is that they're getting it done. I think Kirby Smart is the best coach in the sport at second half adjustments. Even when they lost to Alabama, they held Alabama scoreless in the second half. They play a lot of rivalry games. They still have that game against Georgia Tech at the end of the year, but Florida looks at them as a rival. Auburn looks at them as a rival. And you better believe Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi State, they're all going to bring their best every week against Georgia because they want to take them down. So I think the consistency, the way that they find a way to win, and the second half adjustments, that's what impresses me a lot about this Georgia team.
Yeah, and you brought up a great point that I definitely want to elaborate on too, particularly the part about the second half adjustments, right? Because I remember watching the game versus Ole Miss, and my little brother, he's a big Ole Miss fan, and kind of one of the things that we were talking about is, even though I think Ole Miss, in terms of a team right now, I think they had a lot of advantages, particularly in terms of their offense explosiveness. I also kind of pushed back on them and said, hey, like, even though I do think Ole Miss, I thought they would win the game, there was also a part of me that kind of said to myself, you just can't count out Georgia when it comes to those kind of games, because they're always going to find a way to figure it out. Even when you have a game like that where it was a complete shootout and you just didn't know if Gunnar Stockton would have the passing ability to be able to go toe for toe versus a really strong Old Miss defense who just didn't show up that game for whatever reason.
Yeah, you're not kidding. And it's also like Lane Kiffin wants to beat Kirby Smart so bad. So his game plan was going to be electric, and he was going to try to throw everything he could at Georgia. And they didn't really dominate the second half, but in the fourth quarter, I think they allowed less than 25 yards and no scores against Ole Miss in that game. I mean, that's just phenomenal stuff. When teams finish better than they start, I give a lot of credit to Kirby Smart and the in-game adjustments that him and his staff make.
Yeah, especially now when you look at the college football rankings too, for example, that's kind of one of the conversations that are end up coming up is which teams are, kind of starting hot in September and October versus which teams are actually going to be finishing in November. That's one of the kind of the conversations that are ultimately going to come up too. But, when you look at this Georgia team, at least offensively, I think we got to see a hint of Gunnar Stockton versus Texas in the SEC championship game last year. Now we're kind of seeing his first full season as a starter. And, one of the things that I love watching about him is just how he's able to move his feet. And most importantly, just his poise, particularly in the pocket too. I think he leads the SEC in rushing touchdowns too, which, I was quite impressed by given the amount of quarterbacks are in the SEC. But, Laner, when you look at this Georgia offense, what are some of the things that have kind of stuck out to you in terms of adjustments from 2024 Georgia offense to this year, and what is some things that you kind of anticipate them capitalizing on as they continue through the schedule?
Well, you're exactly right. And I can't say enough good things about Gunnar Stockton. I think he is tough as nails. And we all got to see that when he got thrust into that SEC championship game last year. He got popped on a play that they reviewed for targeting. Ultimately, it wasn't, but he got right back up and kept playing and led Georgia to a second half comeback once again as the backup. And so I love Gunnar Stockton. He does such a great job, like you said, extending plays, reading when the pocket's collapsing, and finding a way to get outside. And yes, in an SEC conference full of quarterbacks that can use their legs a lot better than him, you think of a Trinidad Shambliss, you think of a Diego Pavia, you think of even Arkansas has one of the best dual threat quarterbacks in the country. And for Gunnar Stockton to be the leading SEC touchdown scorer at the quarterback position is unbelievable. The biggest difference between 2024 Georgia and 2025 Georgia is the receiving core. They had so many drops last year. They led the country. They had nobody that was reliable. And this is a school that just a few years before that had Brock Bowers, the best tight end in the country, had Ladd McConkey, who's a phenomenal wide receiver, reliable, dependable targets. And last year they didn't have that at all. This year, I think Zachariah Branch was one of the biggest transfers that went under the radar. They poached him from USC. He's a stud. He's got incredible legs, but he's been a reliable target for them that can stretch the field or also get a quick screenplay in. Humphreys has been incredible. Lucky's been a great tight end for them. So I think the reliability of their pass catchers this year has been the biggest difference.
Yeah, exactly too, because I think Zachariah Branch was one of those guys where I think on paper everybody kind of knew like, hey, if they can set this guy up for success, he can be electric. And I was definitely a little skeptical initially because I was like, man, if they can figure him out, it's he's been a lot of fun to watch this year, especially on special teams too, which I think he can be an incredible weapon for as well. And when you look at this Georgia offense too, I mean, they just have so many different playmakers too. And, I think last year they were kind of relying a little bit more on kind of a more balanced look where it is predicated around Gunnar Stockton's ability to be able to make good decisions, right? But having those reliable pass catchers definitely makes things a lot more simpler and clean and being able to, control the pace of the game too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a game changer for them this year.
Yeah, and defensively too. I mean, going into this game versus Mississippi State, I think one of the things that's going to be talked about, at least for a lot of people, and me included, is I'm really fascinated to see how this pass rush shows up, right? Because Blake Shapen got sacked 7 times versus Texas 2 weeks ago and twice last week versus Arkansas. And Georgia has only had 8 sacks in 8 games this year. So I'm really fascinated to see, one, how this Mississippi State offensive line holds up, and most importantly, can Glenn Schumann and this defense kind of be creative in terms of being able to, get some pressure on the quarterback too? Because I think Georgia definitely has gotten some criticism for that too. But I think at the same time, if you look at the numbers of this Georgia defense, they're really not playing as bad as people kind of make it seem.
Absolutely. I go back and forth on this one, Rob. I don't have a great feel. Part of me just feels like Georgia's going to Georgia. We're going to see another close game, and they're going to emerge in a one-score win. The cowbells are going to be loud in Starkville, and I give Jeff Levy a lot of credit, right? This is a Mississippi State team that only had 2 wins last year. They've already more than doubled their win total. He got his first SEC win, which was a big deal. But people don't realize that record for Mississippi State can be deceiving. They had 2 games that they were in and probably should have won. They blew a 17-point lead against Texas, and they threw that horrendous interception late against Florida, where they were probably already in field goal range with one of the most reliable kickers in the country. But then I look at the matchup, and like you said, man, the pass rushing ability of Georgia is going to be a big factor in this one. And I think Blake Shapen is a great quarterback, but I think he also heavily relies on the connection with Brennan Thompson. And we saw that show up in a big way against Arizona State early in the year for a huge win for them. But I just wonder if Georgia's going to be able to key on that, and Kirby and Schumann are going to have a great game plan against them. So I don't know, man. My gut says another tight win for Georgia, but I don't have a great feel on this one.
Yeah, because I guess for me, when I kind of look at the rest of the schedule, right, is the only other game I didn't mention before was they play Charlotte on November 22nd too. But for me, this feels like a game where I think this could be like kind of a statement win for Georgia in the sense of, okay, the Auburn game and the Ole Miss game, the Florida game, like yeah, they found ways to win, right, and they deserve credit for that, because at the end of the day, you can't entirely control what's on your schedule. You can just win the games that are on your schedule. But I think for me, if I'm looking a little bit fast forward in terms of, who are some of the threats in terms of winning a national championship, I think that's what's kind of missing from this Georgia team. Yes, they have talent. Yes, they have the passing weapons, just like you elaborated on earlier. But like, where's that kind of dominant win where I sit there and say to myself, hey, if I see Georgia in that week one, that round 1 matchup, I'm a little bit nervous, regardless of what Kirby Smart can do.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It feels like such an up for grabs year. I mean, the only 2 teams that have really just absolutely dominated have been Ohio State and Indiana. Indiana had the one tight game with Iowa, but other than that, man, Indiana and Ohio State have just blitzed their competition. Texas A&M undefeated, sitting in that 3 spot for the CFP rankings, but they've had a lot of tight ones, right? They squeak out a tight win at Notre Dame. They've had a lot of close games, even against an Arkansas on the road. So, yeah, man, it's an up for grabs year. I think you're exactly right on that, Rob.
And the last thing I'll ask you too is, we covered our bases a little bit in terms of them offensively and defensively, strengths and weaknesses. But is there anything about this Georgia team that you kind of say to yourself, hey, if this team can exploit blank about Georgia, there could be some concerns for them moving forward for the rest of the season?
You're saying in this matchup with Mississippi State?
Or just them as a team in general, or if you just want to talk about the Pacific matchup versus Mississippi State.
So in general, I think, man, they have gone through a tough gauntlet. I really do think like Georgia's had a tough schedule. And I think that the SEC kind of went 2 years ago when they set the next years. They're like, all right, Alabama and Georgia, we can trust them. We're fine to put them through the gauntlet. And I think when you keep getting to the end of the year, this Texas matchup, for them, it's a must-win. Texas to keep their playoff hopes alive. Mississippi State, I think you mentioned it, like they haven't beat Georgia since 2010. So 15 years, they want to win desperately. Georgia Tech, man, they're playing for a playoff spot as well. I just think every single week you're getting opponents' best. Can Georgia stay the course and continue to show up every single week? And I trust them because I trust that coaching staff. I think Kirby's built a great culture and he's going to get the best out of his players week in and week out. But to me, that's the biggest threat. I also wonder, can you get in a shootout with some of these teams like in Ohio State? Because like if Georgia's defense doesn't play elite like we've seen them in the past, but we've seen Tennessee go light them up. We've seen Ole Miss go light them up this year. if you run into like an Ole Miss, like you've already seen, or an Ohio State, what if they exploit you, man, and then you get too far behind and you can't play keep up? So